We're now
Thank
joined
you.
by the senior Congress leader, Shashi Tharoor. He's written and spoken about education and the draft education policy in the past as well. You had concerns in the past about an imposition of Hindi. That's not going to happen now, it appears. But is there any concern that you may have as far as perhaps foreign languages dwindling as an option or in importance, which is also important as we talk about India in a larger context?
Actually, that's not my concern so much, I must say, Vishnu. I do compliment the Minister, Dr. Ramesh Pokhriyal Nishank, because when he circulated the draft, and some of us gave comments, he invited me for a meeting. We spent about 2 hours together, and he seems to have taken a number of my objections seriously, and those elements have gone from the new policy. So I welcome that. My concern is, you asked about foreign languages, by the way. I think that option still exists, and it's always going to be up to the individuals if they want to do that. So that's not a big concern for me. I have a bigger set of anxieties, not objections as much as concerns. The first is that there is this huge question of why they have unleashed this during the COVID lockdown period without having come to Parliament, presented it, had a discussion, and then adopted the policy. It's almost as if they've forgotten we have a parliamentary system in this country. My second concern is that the aspirations are actually good, and we heard Dr. Kasturi Rangan lay out a very ambitious agenda, which I welcome, but can we ensure they're matched by implementation? Because many of the things that they're talking about in this national education policy requires resources that the Modi government has consistently refused to give education.
In fact,
the target of 6%
of
of GDP is not new. We've been hearing it for decades.
Yeah, in fact, you've written about this from 1948. So 6% of GDP, if we're going to revamp education completely without actually achieving that, it's going to be impossible. So from a financial standpoint, do you believe this is unrealistic in the near future?
Well, it's unrealistic unless part of the cabinet approval is a commitment by the finance minister to allocate more money. Every year in the last 6 years, the budget has actually had less money for education. So can they give us more? And if they're willing to give education more money and they can commit to it, I don't know where that money is coming from, but that will be very useful.
Sure.
Similarly, in particular, the whole research and innovation component of education, which is so indispensable. We've been talking about it for years, going back to Sam Pitroda's time. You know, the truth is that Manmohan Singh at least tried to reach 1% of GDP, though the ultimate target was supposed to be 2%. Under the BJP government, it's come down to 0.6%. And that's really worrying because we don't have enough people in India dedicated to research. And that's the yardstick internationally, globally, as sort of what the standard of education, higher education should be all about.
15
Similarly,
researchers for 1 lakh
about.
of population compared to 111 from China. That's something that
Correct.
you've mentioned. So that's abysmally low, and that's something that needs to be involved. How about the process of learning itself? The fact that children can now choose a lot more, humanities and sciences can work together, the education is more complete. Isn't that something that's going to transform lives?
I think that's very good. One of the things I welcome, by the way, in this document is the implicit built-in flexibility. I've been arguing, for example, a dozen years ago, before I came into politics, I wrote a column about an Oxford study that showed that at that point, 98% of all terrorists arrested or identified in terrorist attacks were engineers. And the reason I surmised is because engineers, particularly in our developing countries, are only taught engineering, the sciences, everything is black and white. It's either this way or that way, switch is either on or off. None of the nuances and subtleties that come with studying liberal arts is available to a science or engineering student. And I had argued at that time, before I came into politics, that we must make it compulsory for science students to learn some humanities and for humanities students to learn some science, so we create more well-rounded human beings. Now, for the first time, this has actually become possible. And if this is something that they will do both in high school and the streaming practice, let kids take the subjects they're good at, so you don't have to only do biology, chemistry, physics. If you happen to be very interested in biology but not interested in physics, and you would like to take a history course, if that's now possible, that's going to be revolutionary. Yeah. And I think it'll really create much more interested, keen minds coming out of our school system. And the same for the colleges. Right now, you take an honors degree, that's all you study pretty much. I remember in my college days, we had 2 subsidiary subjects only in the freshman year, and the rest we were focused heavily on our honors subject. Whereas the American system, for example, encourages you to study a lot of courses well beyond your so-called major. Now, if again this policy implies we're going to do that in India, I think it'll be very good.
Yeah.
It'll bring our undergraduates up to par with the best global standards. So I welcome that.
Another
My
very
worry,
ambitious...
I never quite got to because of your other questions, is that there is implicit a strong tendency towards centralization. I'm a little worried about how much they're going to be shoving onto the private sector because they won't have the resources to do all the things they say they want to do.
Right.
I'm worried about the neglect of adequate, qualified, trained teachers in our system, which this report doesn't seem to do enough to address. And finally, I am concerned that we should ensure our education policy doesn't undo the progress made in extending higher education to the poor and the marginalized in our society. If we have a policy that ends up driving up costs, we will reduce opportunities. We will make education unaffordable for the poor. I don't want a situation where those who are dropping out after 2 years or 3 years, as Dr. Kasturirangan said, is possible. If that happens, if those are all the poor, the lower caste, the tribals, the marginalized, the people who can't afford to stay in full-time education, and that the 4-year degree becomes a preserve of the rich, that would be a real betrayal of what the Indian growth adventure is all about.
Shashi,
so
there's another very ambitious target over here.
Assurances in Parliament.
There's another very ambitious target. Gross enrollment ratio in higher education by 2035 needs to rise from 26% to 50%. That's huge. And again, it seems to be very difficult to implement. How exactly are they going to do that?
Well, it's literally inconceivable because right now you're talking about doubling the number of kids in university. That's what going from 25.8% today to 50% is all about. That'll mean not only doubling the number of students coming into university, it'll mean doubling the number of universities and colleges so they have places to go to, and it will mean dramatically reducing the dropout rate in high school, because right now in government schools in India, by the 9th standard, more than 30% of the students are dropping out for various reasons, including economic. And by the 9th standard, the gross enrollment ratio, which currently, by the way, is over 100% in primary school, drops to 68%. By the 10th, it's even lower. And by the high school, class 11 and 12, our gross enrollment ratio is below 50% in school.
Right.
Now, normally only half of those kids survive to college.
Yep.
So how do we get to that? I mean, one concern that obviously some people have is that this will be a target that won't be met, but the target will justify perhaps some loosening of standards in allowing a lot of substandard institutions to open to fulfill the number of seats available to do this. So
Shashi, just
again,
to go back,
standards and quality must be also paid attention to.
Sure, and just to go back to a point you were talking about, that a longer course of education shouldn't necessarily be the preserve of those who are more well off. But what they've also suggested is a 1-year course for a vocational degree or a diploma course of 2 years, a bachelor's program in 3 years, and a multidisciplinary bachelor's program of 4 years. So, I mean, whatever option you have should perhaps, if a vocational course can get you a job.
So I like that flexibility. I also like the fact that they're going to introduce some vocational training for all kids at school from, I believe, the 6th grade onwards, which means that, let's say, a kid who doesn't know how to change a fuse in his home will learn basic electrical stuff, or a girl who might not normally be entrusted with a hammer and a nail at home will get a chance in school to know how to do it and may discover a talent. All this is great. No, the university system is not that you get a vocational certificate at the end of 1 year. You get a certificate, but that certificate shows what you've learned in 1 year. You might enroll in a regular university course and drop out after 1 year with that certificate, but that doesn't necessarily qualify you for a vocational, a job requiring vocational training. Now, there needs to be very strong vocational training in the country, both in the educational sector and outside it. I mean, one of the things that when I was minister, I called for was for private sector to get heavily into vocational training, oblige every company of a certain size to compulsorily offer vocational training, not only to their own employees, but to students.
Sure.
Now, they might then take the best students for their own companies, that's up to them, but there should be far more people with qualification certificates available to demonstrate they're able to do vocational work. Now, this is
Shashi, last question, running out of time.
Yeah,
the MPhil
sure.
appears to have disappeared, at least in the plans. It's not going to be there anymore. Is that something that it's going to be discontinued? Is that something which, what are your views on that?
I think it's linked to this idea that the fourth year of the BA will be enough to equip an undergraduate or a fresh graduate to go straight into research and into doctoral studies. Now that, for example, is the American system. In America, you do a 4-year BA, you can enroll in a doctoral program. If you don't persist with a doctorate, you can take an MA in between, take a lower level exam and get an MA. But it's not compulsory in every American university to enroll for the MA. You can do you can graduate as a BA after 4 years and enroll in a doctoral program. So if their idea is, listen, our 4th year is going to be so solid, you're equipped with the basics you need to be a researcher or do a doctorate, then you don't need the MPhil as an intermediate step.
Sure.
The MPhil was conceived at a time when you had a 3-year bachelor's degree, and because of the 3 years bachelor's degree, you needed something more to prepare you to be ready to do research, write a thesis, and eventually be qualified enough to do a PhD. Right. That's why the MPhil. We won't need that anymore.
Well, this is all very ambitious. Let's see how it works out. But it's exciting. And people have really thought through all of this. Let's hope a large amount of this is realized. Shashi Tharoor, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks very much for being with us.